Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I wanted to have you as a guest for a long time, so really pleased that you are here.
Thank you.
And my first question is, you are one of the prominent thinkers in the field of humanistic management. Can you perhaps describe what humanistic management actually is for listeners who are not familiar with this term?
Sure, I'm happy to. And humanistic management is really a catchphrase for practices that protect dignity and promote well-being. That's it. And we like to say it's a capital M. So it's not management for just businesses or management for managers in the official authority position, but it's how we manage ourselves, how we manage our lives, how we manage lives with others, our relationships, how we manage organizations, society at large. So the capital M in that humanistic management is actually applicable to pretty much anything we do. And yeah, the main pillars are, first of all, understanding that there is such a thing as inherent value, aka dignity, and then protecting that inherent value. That could be inherent value of the environment, could be inherent value of democracy, for example. It could be the inherent value of human beings and life in general. So that's that. And then the other piece, that once you accept that there is inherent value and not just price or a pricing mechanism which commodifies nature and humans, then the goal is not anymore to organize for maximization of profit or GDP or income, but the goal is becoming broader as what we call, or Aristotle called, eudaimonia, well-being, flourishing is a currently fancy term that many people like. So that's the distinction between what we call humanistic management, and the opposite to it is economistic management. There are other forms of management like tribalistic management, which we see has a resurgence currently because the economistic dominant narrative of management isn't really delivering the goods.
No.
But economistic management has informed global politics, organizations, and our lives for the last 200 years, and especially in the last 30 years, where really the objective is to become wealthy, to become powerful, to have status, and everything else sort of hopefully emerges as good. But we see that this has created a larger crisis that we can, well, like Pope Francis would say, experience at all levels, the individual level, depression, suicide rates are going up, the team level. Most people don't like teams. The organizations, really, people need comedic relief like The Office or the spin-offs of that, or Dilbert to get a grip.
Yeah.
And at societal level, we all see how things are actually reversing in some way of what we call societal progress by becoming more antagonistic, polarized, dysfunctional, really not addressing the major issues that humanity at large is facing.
Yeah. And how did you discover and become involved in humanistic management? I'm curious what triggered you. Was there a particular event or either in your life or let's say in business which said to you, look, our current economic system is hitting its limits?
Yeah, I've been asked this before, and I'm looking at that, and there are multiple events probably in everybody's life that sort of determine where you're going. But one of the earlier ones that I remember was when I was in Germany growing up. I grew up near Switzerland and France, so the furthest away from the then border between East Germany and West Germany. So there
Yeah.
was a communist and a capitalist sort of system, a lab, so to speak, right? But when I visited my grandparents, I think I must have been like 10 years old or something. My brother and I, we liked playing soccer, and I believe we saw out of the forest where we were walking a field, and we thought we could play there. And then our parents held us back and said, no, no, you can't go there. There are mines. And then when we went there, we saw the big fence and towers with people with guns on watchtowers pointing their guns at us. And I was like, wow, that's weird. That's Germany and Germany.
Yeah.
And where I grew up, I had France and Switzerland, and I was biking through Switzerland every day to go to school, no problem. But within the same country, you would basically be shot at if you were to try to cross the border. And so that just made me question what is going on. And yeah, of course, it had to do with the history of Germany and World War II and all of those things. But underlying that was even there a clash of worldviews of what is the right society, what's the right economic system, right? And so I think those questions started very early in my head to figure out. It's like, it seems the only people over the last 200 years that have thought powerfully about this were Adam Smith on the one hand, and then Karl Marx on the other hand.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's it. And it's like, wow, no updates since. And it's sort of weird. And I believe both of them spoke to something very fundamental.
Yeah.
But there must be a higher level of integration possible. And that's then what at some point got me to think about it more deeply. I mean, I've been thinking about it very deeply, trying to find answers through my studies. And really, the university studies didn't deliver. I then worked for a company, a consulting company, and I think that was probably a decisive experience with. This must be better. You can do better.
I think consulting firms and private banks are kind of, it's hard to get more capitalistic than that.
Yeah, and it's just all cost reduction and human resource. And it's nice to some degree, right? It's nice to some degree, and they try to be high status and give you some perks and things like that. But on the other hand, it's like, wow, is that all? Is that everything? And I guess I was confronted with my inner struggle, what Rutger Bregman, I think, calls moral ambition. I did feel, growing up Catholic, there must be something higher that I can service than running around, flying around to clients to get them to reduce costs. And so anyhow, that's multiple things sort of happened in that space where I just thought this can't be the best that humanity is capable of. And so ultimately, I tried to look in all the sectors, working for public government agencies, working for nonprofit agencies, creating my own, worked in the business sector for a long time, and then said, okay, well, I think there's really a gap. So that's what got me going, trying to understand what's happening. And I figured at the time when I did my dissertation that really trust was a key issue, and trust in the system, trust in the organization, trust in your leader was sort of something that contradicted the economic logic. And many of the things that we want in life actually contradict the economic logic. Like many of the things that are important to us, trust, love, happiness, they actually get more when you expend them, when you spend them.
Yeah, it's a kind of inverse economy. Yeah.
It's like you share it, and actually abundance effects come in. It's like, okay, well, you withhold it. It's not like you're saving anything.
No.
You're just depriving yourself. So in that sense, that's how I came to study and look at that. And the term humanistic management at some point came into my head because I grew up in a humanistic education. I studied Latin and languages and philosophy and all of that. But there was no connection with business, really. And I was like, oh, okay. So colleagues and I were looking at that from a similar experiential, experience, and then looking at that, it's like, we can do better. So it just happened at some point that we tried to work with humanism and business, humanistic management, humanistic leadership, various sort of classifiers. At the time when we did this, there wasn't that much else. But since then, you've seen many other sort of iterations happen: conscious business, responsible business. I think all of those qualifiers go at the same thing, that the dominant perspective of that informs us about who we are as human beings and what we want is insufficient. It's not completely wrong, but it's insufficient.
I first came across the term humanistic management during the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think the pandemic serves as a catalyst for humanistic management, and if so, why?
Well, I think the pandemic is just, it was an amplifier for many of the things that that work. I'll say that, right? We were getting somehow something done despite a real like new health scare. Got a vaccine in record time, and all of that global collaboration was actually working. And we were also working in many ways socially together to prevent the worst impacts. But yes, for sure, I think that most people then understood their foundational social nature, right?
Yeah,
When we were complaining about being with other people, all of a sudden we were forced to be isolated, and all of a sudden we saw that our health is actually impacted by this isolation. And that was a wake up call for many people, I believe. But it was
yeah,
also a wake up call for them to see, okay, that current work life arrangements don't necessarily support them in their own flourishing. And you see the great resignation, the quiet quitting, and all of that phenomenon come from that. And I think that still most of the industries that are very traditionally economistic, low pay, low benefit, low quality of life, so to speak, people aren't willing to accept that.
yeah. Yeah, and what I've also seen, and I don't know if you've seen that phenomenon as well. I also saw that somehow it seems like a lot of businesses were more, becoming to a certain extent that hierarchies mattered less, or became smaller, because I think everyone was, dealing with the same circumstances, the same
Right.
situation, trying to work from home with kids in the
Hmm.
background,
Hmm.
juggling multiple hats. So I also had an idea that was also, let's say, that served as a kind of, catalyst to perhaps a different style of management.
Yeah, well, it certainly humanized in that sense everybody, right? And the technology that we have developed, which is phenomenal, right? That we were
Yeah,
able to keep working in that way through Zoom or other technology platforms. I mean, that's just unimaginable, right? How would we have done that earlier? But we were able to do this. And yes, one of the aspects is, of course, yeah, we became more human to each
yeah,
other when we were communicating, right? But I also think that most people, including the top level, couldn't hide anymore. And the impact of them being dependent on a functioning society, a healthy workforce became more clear, right? And I think Madonna or some other people said that the virus does not know your status,
no, no,
right?
no. It's a
Yeah.
great equalizer in that sense.
So
Yeah.
at one time it may have been a great equalizer, and then you saw the same inequalities kick in again in terms of who could afford what kind of
Hmm.
healthcare, where would you actually get infected more so than others. People that were working low wage jobs that are called necessary, right? The ones that
Yeah.
were really critical, they were the most exposed. So it's weird in our society then, so that you then basically got exposed as the fraud that we are, where the most critical people are the ones that are most endangered and typically the least paid, and everybody else is sort of like dispensable, and can work from home or doesn't have to work at all, or things
Yeah.
like that. But they're typically more paid
Yeah.
or better.
Yeah. Hey, in one of your articles, you say that we experienced the prelude to a paradigm change in management theories, since we cannot satisfactorily address the current problems with the theories at our disposal. And in this context, you seem to encourage a shift in management theories from focusing on wealth to focusing on well-being. Now, I think measuring wealth, we have a kind of great universal yardstick from that called money, and we can express anything
Mhm.
around wealth in quantitative terms. But how how can well-being be measured and be, let's say, a subject to economic or quantifiable studies?
Yeah, that's a critical question. I'm not saying that we have the answers yet, but we have many smart people focusing on how we can measure well-being. Now, I would say the most single, well, one of the key single indicators is just a question like, how alive do you feel? Or I feel alive, and then do you agree? Do you disagree? Right? And most people will sort of like pause and like, wow, what does it mean? But do I really feel alive? And most people in corporations would say, "Oh, yeah, not really. I feel more like a zombie, or I feel more like I'm half human or something, or I can't bring my full humanity to the task." And so bringing your full humanity, I think, is when you are alive and when you become alive. And that's where well-being is located, right? It could be that there are many difficult circumstances around you happening. It's maybe that you have to work hard, or that there is a flood, or something else happening, a pandemic. But you can still be well in that context and alive in that context.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that state of flow that other people describe, that's sort of an aspirational state. But I think that if we focus on that, then we can probably do better in terms of managing the conditions that will allow that more so than not. And it's good and potentially important to be reminded of the history of how we actually came about money and how clear and simple money as a yardstick is. Because money has inflation, money has all kinds of problems. As such, you can count it. You could be very wealthy, quote unquote, but not own anything. Like to the outside in the United States, for example, very wealthy, but much of it is based on debt. So, what does it mean to be wealthy in that context when you actually own nothing? Or you have to pay it back and you're basically enslaved to whatever credit institution to pay it back. So there is a problem there, but also the way that we actually as a society or in the business world created common accounting standards that you can still fudge as you want in accounting, as everybody knows. Like that's not really a helpful measure of anything much either. It just pretends to be. And I think that's sort of what we've lapsed into, that this is so easy. And I think the other thing is equally easy, complicated, etc. It's just a matter of will and intention. What is it that we prioritize? And I think you see that the conversation has shifted a lot since at least we started that kind of research 20 years
Yeah.
ago, something like that, 22 years ago. And it's like, wow, yeah, you see the OECD has developed happiness or well-being indices. The UN, as a representation of the world governments, has accepted the Sustainable Development Goals that came out of the Millennium Development Goals that will probably find a successor in some way because the criteria of traditional economic growth in GDP are clearly insufficient. And so this is the new opportunity for everybody involved. It's like, what do we care about? What do we want the future to look like? Or what do we want the present to be like? And yeah, clearly we want some prosperity, but the measure of prosperity in terms of money may
Yeah.
misguide.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. There's a difference between doing economically well according to certain standards and feeling well, if you understand what I mean. There is a dichotomy there.
Yeah.
But if you were critical, you could say, well, at the end of the day, how sustainable is humanistic management? I mean, you have all kind of, let's say, companies with lofty goals, right? I mean, for instance,
Mm.
an enlightened and highly successful organization like Google, for instance, laid off 12,000 staff in 2023 in the light of the different economic reality that we face today. Shell, tried to be a more enlightened oil and gas company, but recently decided to drop its target to cut oil production to prioritize the shareholder payouts. And
Hmm.
Unilever, where former CEO Peter Polman once personified stakeholder value, is spinning off parts of its business and cutting jobs to satisfy its
Mm.
shareholders. So are these not examples that, at the end of the day, shareholder value will always prevail in our economic system?
Yeah, maybe, and I doubt it. Because shareholder value is a relatively new invention. And so it's important to take that into perspective. This was actually a very successful academic project supported by moneyed interests and playing into hand of powerful groups, incumbent businesses, and their investors and their owners. And so there is a playbook to that, the Powell Memorandum that was published in 1970, that you can go back and you see like, wow, that was engineered. And it's become sort of the doctrine that is accepted or seemingly like dominant and all powerful. And you see the cracks in it because it just doesn't deliver for a majority of people and hasn't. And I'm reminded of Kofi Annan, I think in 2001 or 2002, he spoke about the impact of this neoliberal thinking on globalization, when at the time everybody was excited and it seemed to be in agreement that it's better for the world to adopt these kind of business practices, shareholder value maximization, whatever we call the neoliberal doctrine or ideas for the world economy. And China didn't follow it, right?
No.
China seemingly is better off, at least if you want to see like well-being or reduction in poverty, etc. They did that intentionally in a closed way. And so we see that then Kofi Annan said, if globalization doesn't work for everyone, it will work for no one. And that's where we are. People are retreating. People are going back to tribalist perspectives.
Yeah.
All across the globe, you see basically whoever wins right now is challenging that neoliberal narrative, is challenging this shareholder value maximization doctrine. And you see even the most powerful companies in the United States in 2019, I believe they felt compelled to write that they want to shift towards stakeholder capitalism. Does that mean that the infrastructure that supports them, like the finance system, Wall Street, is following? No. But even there, you see increasingly people very worried about this short-term thinking, this kind of ideology, because the evidence that we have so far is that that which is good for humans is actually also more sustainable. So that which hurts humans logically cannot be as sustainable. And if then shareholder value maximization hurts people, it is not as sustainable as something else. Do we know what stakeholder capitalism is? Do we know what's happening? Well, unfortunately, we still have the structures by which young MBA students that have learned nothing else but the neoliberal sort of ideas and that have no entrepreneurial spirit or understanding, have never run organizations, they basically evaluate publicly listed organizations, which are very few, but dominate the narrative. And they say, all right, you got to cut costs. So you have those influence the leadership of Google, you have those influence the leadership of Unilever, of Shell. And it's very difficult to put long-term thinking into publicly listed corporations.
Yeah.
Now, when you see humanistic management, it works very well in many places, but it's very difficult to continuously do that in the context of a system like the financial system that's currently set up that is short-term oriented.
Yeah.
And that actually can be undone, can be recreated. Private equity is an attempt to that. Now, you see much of private equity is sort of exploitative. But you can also imagine that that may actually support more long-term thinking. You see that many people that are potentially owners of companies want to delist, don't want to stay in the public sort of markets.
Yeah. Yeah.
The number of public corporations is decreasing and has been steadily decreasing. So that model may be a dinosaur in many ways, even though it occupies the mind share or the mind space of the newspapers, because that's what people can report about, right? It's very difficult to report about family companies or privately held organizations. especially when they're not customer focusing. Yeah, so that's just, I think, unpacking some of that dominance is critical. And I don't disagree that there is a very strong infrastructure that's quote unquote economistic, that forces the main players in the system to be short-term oriented.
Yeah. Hey, I spent a number of years working in the financial services industry, and
Mm-hmm.
what humanistic management stands for seems to be quite far removed from the DNA of that particular industry, both internal relations as well as external ones. Bonuses and obtaining mandates
Mm-hmm.
from private clients and businesses seems to be very transaction oriented and centered around zero-sum games. If someone else wins, I'm losing. Do you think certain industries might be more receptive to humanistic management than others, or do you consider humanistic management, to be industry agnostic and in principle applicable to any industry?
Yeah, I think the latter. It's industry agnostic. But as you described, the DNA of the finance industry is economistic. Straight out of the book. Unfortunately, finance has an outsized influence in the world. Yes. And do you see some shifts in finance? Potentially. Larry Fink and Ray Dalio and some of those people that are interested in sort of like having their investment be long-term viable, they know that that kind of short-term thinking is very risky and dangerous. Is that going to shift the finance industry? Probably not, because they are swimming in that water without being conscious of it. And then you cannot change. So what does it require? I don't know. It does require public policy. It does require maybe new segments in a public market, maybe rethinking the stock exchange or public funding or whatever that may be. So whatever that next model or could be that actually is finance for the public good. But in the end, I don't think we'll find a solution to the issues that we have if finance isn't serving the real economy. If the real economy or the economy services finance, we're just doomed. And that's where we are right now.
If listeners want to learn more about humanistic management, which resources, in addition to your books on the topic, which I will include in the show notes below, but are there any, let's say, resources that you could recommend to them to read and learn more about the topic?
Yeah, so there's the website, the Humanistic Management International website. We have a YouTube channel. We have a lot of people in a similar fashion, like giving their perspectives, talks, etc. They're not necessarily podcasts, but YouTube clips. We have a number of documentaries that were produced and that we are producing that sort of give a different perspective on what's possible about organizations that have practiced humanistic management, even though they actually didn't call it that. Some did, but yeah. So that's I think a way to check out more. I mean, there are lots of books that are sort of going in that direction. Some of the more classical books that people might be familiar with are Good to Great, which is basically an evidence-based book, and
Yeah,
it showcases, okay,
Collins.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
if you want to have an excellent organization, you got to focus on the human beings underneath, and there is a little bit more complexity involved that requires connecting it to a higher purpose. So you have those kind of managerial books. Peter Drucker is a humanist. You have many of the other folks that are sort of very visible and important, like Henry Mintzberg. And I'm blanking on the name of the guy who's getting a lot of credit in marketing. But he also considers himself a humanist.
Hmm.
Tom Peters, who wrote with, I think, Roger Waterman, The Search for Excellence at
Yeah,
some
yeah, yeah.
point, calls himself a humanist. So you see a lot of that humanistic thinking is present in some of
Hmm.
the major leadership thinkers.
Yeah.
We just gave it a certain label and a name. And yeah, there's a lot of academic literature, at least, in that space.
Super. And I'll make sure to refer to the websites and documentaries in the show notes. So once people read them, they can find it. Michael, finally, we covered a number of aspects of humanistic management. Are there any aspects that you consider to be important and would like to mention that we haven't discussed yet?
Huh. Good question. I think just like from the perspective that I live my life, I think humanistic management is both a reality and a potentiality. It's like it's a possibility to live into, and it's never perfect, and it's never, I don't know, like easy
No.
to do it. The simplicity of economistic management, where it's like a blueprint, cutting costs, transactional behavior, may be easier for some people or may seem easier. In fact, whenever I tried that kind of management, it was much harder because I couldn't reconcile who I wanted to be as a person with the kind of behavior that I was exhibiting. And I think we are all tempted in that space. So I think what ultimately is important to understand that humanistic management as a reality and possibility requires grace. There is no perfection, and everybody can criticize everybody that something is not yet perfect, and maybe dignity is not fully acknowledged or well-being is not fully achieved, and it's a journey. So that's what I just want to leave people with, because oftentimes in the current discourse, you get a lot of people very loud, vocal, criticizing everything, every attempt to improving something. At the same time, you have lots of people claiming all kinds of good things that are in fact bullshit. And so dancing in between that, calling out the bullshit, but also seeing the actual authentic intention of others that would want to make or be on that journey wherever they start. I think that should be invited to play, yeah, to be part of a game in some ways, something that we can enjoy together and try together.
Michael, thank you very much. I learned a lot from you, and I learned a lot about humanistic management. So thank you very much for this interview and for participating in the podcast.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And yeah,
Thank
looking
you.